The morning sun filled the penthouse office of Maxwell Industries. Richard Maxwell stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city he practically owned. At 45, he had everything a man could want: money, power, and now, the perfect woman to complete his image. In just 3 days, he would marry Victoria Cambridge, the most sought-after socialite in New York. Maria Rodriguez pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway of the executive floor. She had been working at Maxwell Industries for 5 years, always keeping to herself, always watching. She saw how Victoria treated the staff when Richard wasn't around, how she made calls to someone named James late at night when she thought no one was listening. But it wasn't Maria's place to say anything. She was just the cleaning lady, invisible to people like them. "The flowers for the wedding will cost a fortune," Victoria's voice carried from Richard's office as Maria cleaned nearby. "But Daddy says, image is everything. We need to show everyone that the Cambridges and Maxwells are the perfect match." Richard laughed, but Maria heard the strain in it. She had noticed how he seemed different lately, more distant, as if something was bothering him. Sometimes she caught him staring at old family photos when everyone else had gone home. That evening, after most employees had left, Maria found Richard still in his office, loosening his tie with shaking hands. "Are you all right, Mr. Maxwell?" she asked before she could stop herself. He turned, surprised. Most people didn't notice Maria, but Richard had always been different. He had always said hello, asked about her family, remembered her son's name. "Just wedding jitters, Maria," he said, but his voice was hollow. "Did you know I grew up poor? My mother cleaned houses just like—" He stopped, embarrassed. "Just like me," Maria finished with a gentle smile. "There's no shame in honest work, Mr. Maxwell." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something for the first time. "No, there isn't. Sometimes I wonder if I've forgotten that." The next morning, Richard didn't show up for work. His Ferrari was found wrapped around a tree on the coastal highway. The doctors said he might never wake up. Victoria came to the hospital in designer clothes and perfect makeup, always when photographers were present. "Darling," she would say, touching his hand with manicured fingers, "you must wake up. The wedding venue is non-refundable." But it was Maria who came every day after her shift, sitting quietly by his bed, talking to him about normal things. Her son's baseball games, the changing seasons, the office gossip. She brought fresh flowers from her garden, not the expensive arrangements that Victoria sent and that died untouched. "You know," she told him one evening, "my mother always said that sometimes we have to lose everything to find what really matters." She didn't know that Richard could hear her, trapped in the darkness of his coma. He heard everything. Victoria's phone calls to James in the hallway, planning how to take control of his company, his brother Peter's visits with lawyers, the whispered conversations about power of attorney. But most of all, he heard Maria. Her voice became his anchor, her stories a lifeline to the world. While others talked about his money, his properties, his shares, she talked to him about life, about hope, about second chances. Then one night, as Maria read to him from her favorite book, his fingers moved. Just a twitch, but she noticed. She always noticed everything about him. "Richard," she whispered, heart pounding, "if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." He did. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she pressed the call button for the nurse. In that moment, she didn't think about how this would change everything, how Victoria would come rushing back, how the photographers would crowd the hospital entrance again. All she thought about was the weak pressure of his fingers against hers, and how it felt like the beginning of something neither of them had expected. The doctors rushed in, amazed at his rapid improvement. Within hours, Richard opened his eyes to a world that had changed in his absence. Victoria stood by his bed in an expensive dress, cameras flashing behind her. But his eyes searched the room until they found Maria, standing quietly in the corner with her cleaning cart, just as she had been that evening in his office when everything began to change. And in that moment, Richard Maxwell, the man who had everything, realized he might have been looking for happiness in all the wrong places. The next few days at St. Michael's Hospital were chaos. News of Richard Maxwell's recovery spread like wildfire, and reporters camped outside wanting to know if the billionaire would still marry Victoria Cambridge. Nobody paid attention to Maria, as she quietly continued her cleaning duties, watching everything unfold around her. Victoria made sure she was there every morning when the doctors did their rounds. She would hold Richard's hand and talk about their wedding plans as if nothing had changed. But Richard wasn't the same man who had crashed his car 3 months ago. The accident had changed something in him. The company shares have dropped 15%, Peter, Richard's brother, said one afternoon while looking at his tablet. We need to make a public statement about your return. Richard stared out the window. How much money did you transfer to offshore accounts while I was in a coma, Peter? The room went silent. Peter's face turned white. I don't know what you're talking about. I heard everything, Richard said quietly. Every conversation, every phone call, every plan you and Victoria made with James Harrison from our competition. Victoria's perfect makeup couldn't hide her shock. Darling, you must be confused. The medication, I heard you, Victoria. Every night planning how to take control of my company once you married me. Planning how to push me out with Peter's. Help? Richard's voice was calm, but his hands were shaking. Get out, both of you. You can't just... Peter started. I said get out. Richard's voice boomed through the room. Security guards appeared at the door, summoned by Maria, who had been quietly cleaning nearby and heard everything. After they left, Richard sat in silence for a long time. Maria finished cleaning the room, taking longer than usual, knowing he didn't want to be alone. They thought I was nothing, he finally said. Just a body in a bed, a signature they needed for their plans. Maria put down her cleaning supplies. Would you like some water, Mr. Maxwell? He looked at her, really looked at her, just like that night in his office before the accident. Why did you stay? All those nights, reading to me, talking to me. Why? Because everyone deserves to have someone care about them as a person, not just for what they own, she said simply. Richard felt tears in his eyes for the first time since he was a child. I remember your voice, you know. When everything was dark, when I couldn't move or speak, your voice was like a light showing me the way back. Maria blushed and turned to her cart. I should finish my rounds. Wait, Richard called after her. What's your son's name again? The one who plays baseball. Tommy, she said, surprised he remembered. He has a game this Saturday. Does he still pitch? Maria nodded, a proud smile lighting up her face. He's getting better every day. Worked all summer to improve his curveball. I'd like to see him play someday, Richard said softly. Before Maria could respond, Dr. Evans came in with test results. The news wasn't what anyone expected. The accident had left Richard with a rare condition affecting his heart. He would need constant care and monitoring for at least 6 months. You'll need someone with medical training, the doctor explained, and you'll have to take it easy. No work, no stress, no big decisions. Richard laughed bitterly. Well, that takes care of the wedding at least. That evening, Maria found him trying to reach a cup of water, his hands trembling from the new medication. She hurried to help him. Thank you, he said, then hesitated. Maria, I have a strange request. Would you consider being my home care aide? The hospital can train you, and I'll pay for all the certifications. I trust you, and right. Now that's worth more than any medical degree. Maria stared at him, stunned. But Mr. Maxwell, I'm just a cleaning lady. No, he said firmly. Oh, you're the only person who saw me as a human being when I had nothing. When I couldn't move or speak. When I was nothing but a body in a bed. You were there, talking to me about your life, your son, treating me like a person instead of a bank account. Tears filled Maria's eyes. I would need to talk to Tommy. He's only 14, and since his father left... Bring him to live with us, Richard said impulsively. My house is too big for one person anyway. He can practice baseball in the backyard. I'll help him with his curveball once I'm stronger. People will talk, Maria warned. They'll say terrible things about both of us. Richard took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. Let them talk. I've spent my whole life caring about what people think, trying to be the perfect businessman, trying to marry the perfect socialite. Look where that got me. Maybe it's time to start caring about what's real. Maria looked down at their joined hands, his pale and manicured, hers worn from years of hard work. Are you sure about this? The only thing I'm sure about is that you're... A voice brought me back from the darkness. Everything else, and he smiled slightly. Everything else we can figure out together. That night, as Maria drove home to her small apartment, her mind was spinning. Tomorrow she would have to tell Tommy about the offer, about moving to a mansion, about how their whole life was about to change. She didn't know how her son would react, or how she would handle being more than just the invisible cleaning lady. But when she thought about Richard's smile, about the way he remembered Tommy's baseball, about how he trusted her when he had every reason not to trust anyone, she knew she had to take this chance. Sometimes life gave you an opportunity to be more than what others saw when they looked at you. Sometimes, if you were brave enough, you could step out of the shadows and into a whole new story. Tommy sat on his bed, clutching his baseball glove, while Maria explained everything. The small apartment they'd called home for the last 10 years suddenly felt different, like a chapter that was about to end. "So this rich guy wants us to live in his mansion?" Tommy asked, his voice suspicious. At 14, he had already seen enough of life to be wary of things that seemed too good to be true. "Just because you talked to him while he was sick." Maria sat next to her son, touching his dark hair that needed a trim. "Mr. Maxwell needs help recovering, Tommy. He trusts me, and he's offering us a chance at a better life." "But what if he changes his mind? What if we move in and then he decides he doesn't want us anymore, like Dad did?" Maria's heart broke a little at the pain in her son's voice. Carlos had left them when Tommy was just 8, disappearing to Miami with his new girlfriend, and leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. "Mr. Maxwell is different," Maria said softly. "He remembers that you play baseball. He wants to help you practice when he gets better." Tommy's eyes lit up despite his attempt to stay cool. "Really? He said that?" "Yes, mi amor, and his backyard is big enough for a proper pitching practice." That weekend, Maria and Tommy moved into Richard Maxwell's mansion in the expensive part of town. Their few belongings looked out of place in the grand house, but Richard had insisted they make themselves at home. "Tommy's room is next to the game room," Richard said from his wheelchair. The doctors had finally released him from the hospital, but he was still weak. "I had some baseball memorabilia put up in there. I hope that's okay." Tommy tried to hide his excitement as he opened the door to his new room. His eyes went wide at the signed jerseys on the walls and the professional catcher's mitt displayed. On a shelf. "This is mine," he whispered. "All yours," Richard smiled. "Maybe you can teach me about baseball while I recover. I never had time for sports before." Maria watched them from the doorway, her heart full. This was crazy, she thought. A cleaning lady and her son living in a mansion with one of the richest men in the city. People would talk, and talk they did. The next day, Victoria showed up unannounced, her high heels clicking angrily on the marble floors. "So the rumors are true," she said, looking at Maria with disgust. "You've moved your maid in. Have you completely lost your mind, Richard?" Richard wheeled himself between Victoria and Maria. "I've finally found my mind, actually. Maria and Tommy are my guests, and this is my house. You're not welcome here anymore, Victoria." "You'll regret this," Victoria hissed. "The board won't stand for you turning into some kind of charity case. And when your brother presents the evidence of your mental instability..." "What evidence?" Tommy stepped forward, phone in hand. "You mean like this video I just recorded of you threatening Mr. Maxwell? I bet the board would love to see that." Victoria's face went pale. She turned and stormed out, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and the echo of her threats. Richard turned to Tommy with newfound respect. "Quick thinking, young man." Tommy shrugged, trying to act casual. "Mom always says to watch out for people who act nice to your face, but mean something else. I didn't trust that lady." Later that night, after Tommy went to bed, Maria found Richard in his study looking at old photographs. "I'm sorry about Victoria," she said, setting down his evening medicine. "I never meant to cause trouble." "You didn't cause anything," Richard said firmly. "Victoria and Peter showed their true colors while I was in that hospital bed. I just didn't want to see it before." He picked up a photo of a woman in a cleaning uniform. "This is my mother. Did I ever tell you about her?" Maria shook her head, sitting down across from him. "She cleaned houses to put me through college, worked herself to the bone so I could have a better life. And what did I do? I got rich and became exactly like the people who used to look down on her. I was so busy trying to prove I belonged in their world that I forgot where I came from. It's not too late to remember, Maria said softly. Richard reached across the desk and took her hand. The touch sent warmth through both of them, surprising. In its intensity, thank you, he whispered, for bringing me back to myself. The moment was interrupted by a crash from upstairs, followed by Tommy's voice. I'm okay, just knocked over a lamp practicing my pitch. They both laughed, the tension broken. But something had shifted between them, something neither was ready to name yet. Days turned into weeks. Richard grew stronger, working with a physical therapist in the mornings and watching Tommy practice baseball in the afternoons. Maria kept the house running smoothly, but now as its manager rather than its cleaning lady. She hired staff, organized Richard's medical care, and slowly brought warmth to the cold mansion. But outside their peaceful bubble, trouble was brewing. Peter Maxwell was gathering allies on the company board, preparing for a fight. Victoria was giving interviews to tabloids, painting Richard as a man who had lost his mind after his accident. And somewhere in Miami, Carlos, Tommy's father, had seen his son's picture in the society pages and was starting to wonder if it was time to reconnect with his family. The peace they had found couldn't last forever. Storm clouds were gathering, and soon they would all have to face the consequences of their unconventional arrangement. But for now, in the quiet evening hours, as Tommy did his homework at the kitchen table while Richard and Maria shared coffee and quiet conversation, none of that seemed to matter. They had created something rare and precious, a real family built not on blood or money but on trust and caring. More coffee? Maria asked, noticing Richard's cup was empty. Please, he smiled, their fingers brushing as she took his cup. Neither. Mentioned how their touch lingered a moment longer than necessary, or how their eyes met with increasing warmth. Some things didn't need to be said. Not yet. For now it was enough to be here, to be healing, to be becoming something new together. The morning paper landed on Richard's desk with a thud. The headline made his blood boil. Maxwell Industries CEO gone mad? Sources claim accident. Led to mental instability. Below was a picture of him in his wheelchair with Maria and Tommy in the background. They're trying to make me look crazy, Richard said, his hands shaking as he read the article. Victoria gave them everything. The fact that I fired the old staff, that I moved in a former cleaning lady and her son, that I'm not returning to work yet. Maria placed a calming hand on his shoulder. We knew they would try something like this. The board meeting is tomorrow, Richard said, running his fingers through his graying hair. Peter's going to try to take control. He's going to use this to prove I'm not fit to lead the company. Tommy walked in, his school backpack slung over one shoulder. He took one look at the newspaper and frowned. Those people are mean. Just like the kids at school who make fun of me for living here. Maria's head snapped up. What kids? You never told me about this? Tommy shrugged, trying to act tough. It's no big deal. They just say stuff about how we're gold diggers and that you and Mr. Maxwell, you know. Richard's face darkened. I'll call the school. No, Tommy said quickly. That'll just make it worse. I can handle it. He looked down at his feet. I just wish people understood that we're not bad people. Maria pulled her son into a hug, feeling his resistance melt away despite his teenage pride. Mi amor, people will always talk. What matters is that we know the truth. And what is the truth? A new voice cut through the room. They all turned to see Carlos, Tommy's father, standing in the doorway. He looked exactly as he had 6 years ago when he walked out, handsome in a flashy way, with too much gel in his hair, and a smile that promised everything, but meant nothing. Dad. Tommy's voice was small, uncertain. Hey, champion. Carlos spread, his arms wide. Aren't you going to give your old man a hug? Tommy stayed where he was, pressed against his mother's side. Maria felt him trembling. What are you doing here, Carlos? Her voice was ice cold. Can't a father visit his son, especially when he sees him in all the papers, living in this big, fancy house? Carlos looked around appreciatively. You've done well for yourself, Maria, very well. Get out. Richard's voice was quiet but firm. He wheeled himself between Carlos and his family, and the thought struck him suddenly that's what they had become. His family. And you must be the famous Richard Maxwell, Carlos smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The man who took in my family. Tell me, what exactly are your intentions with my wife? Ex-wife, Maria corrected. You lost the right to ask those questions when you abandoned us. Abandoned is such a harsh word. Carlos moved further into the room. I needed to find myself. But now I'm back and I want to make things right. Tommy needs his father. I needed my father 6 years ago, Tommy said, his voice shaking. I needed him when I made the baseball team, when I broke my arm, when Mom had to work 3 jobs to keep us going. Where were you then? Carlos's smile faltered. Son, I know I made mistakes. Save it, Tommy cut him off. Mr. Maxwell has been more of a father to me in 3 months than you were in 8 years. Mr. Maxwell? Carlos laughed. The man's clearly lost his mind. Everyone's talking about it. Living with his maid, letting her kid call him dad. The papers are right. The accident scrambled his brains. Richard surged forward in his wheelchair, but Maria beat him to it. She stepped right up to Carlos, her eyes blazing. You want to know the truth? The truth is that Richard Maxwell has more humanity in his little finger than you have in your whole body. He saw us, really saw us, when people like you only saw what they could get from us. He gave Tommy a home where he can practice baseball, where he can do his homework in peace, where he doesn't have to worry about the electricity being cut off because his father gambled away the bill money. The room fell silent. Even Tommy looked at his mother with new eyes, never having heard her speak about those dark days after Carlos left. You're making a scene, Maria, Carlos said, his charm cracking. Think about how this looks. I don't care how it looks, Maria shot back. For once in my life, I'm exactly where I want to be, with people who care about more than appearances. Richard wheeled forward, his voice steady. I'm calling security. You're trespassing, Mr. Rodriguez. This isn't over, Carlos warned, backing toward the door. I have rights. He's my son. Rights? Tommy laughed bitterly. You gave those up when you left. I don't want to see you again, Dad. Ever. After Carlos was escorted out, the 4 of them sat in the kitchen, the breakfast Maria had prepared growing, cold on the table. The silence was heavy with unspoken emotions. I'm sorry, Richard finally said. All of this, the papers, the rumors, your father showing up, it's because of me, because I brought you into my complicated life. No, Maria touched his hand. It's because you brought us into your heart. And that's worth any amount of complications, Tommy nodded, pushing his eggs around his plate. Yeah, and anyway, we brought complications too, like Dad. He'll be back, Maria said quietly. I know Carlos. He smells money, and he won't give up easily. Richard squeezed her hand. Let him try. We'll face him together. We'll face everything together. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation for tomorrow's board meeting. Richard's lawyers came and went, bringing documents and strategies. But in the evening, as always, they gathered in the family room. Tommy did his homework while Richard helped him with math problems. Maria sat nearby folding laundry, the domestic piece of the scene a stark contrast to the morning's drama. Mom? Tommy looked up from his textbook. Did you mean what you said to Dad? About being exactly where you want to be? Maria looked at her son, then at Richard, who was watching her with warm eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. Yes, she said softly. This is exactly where I want to be. Richard's smile lit up his whole face, and in that moment, none of tomorrow's battles seemed to matter. They had found something rare and precious in this unlikely family they'd created. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The Maxwell Industries boardroom was filled with tension. 12 board members sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces serious as they watched Richard wheel himself to the head of the table. Maria stood behind him, her hand resting supportively on his wheelchair. Peter Maxwell stood up, straightening his expensive tie. I must object to the presence of the household staff at this meeting. Maria stays, Richard said firmly. She's my medical assistant, as documented by the hospital. Or would you prefer I risk another health episode without proper care present? Peter's face reddened, but he sat back down. Victoria sat next to him, wearing a black dress like she was at a funeral. She smirked at Maria, who kept her head high. Members of the board, Peter began, holding up a stack of papers. We're here today because we're concerned about my brother's mental state following his accident, his recent behavior, firing long time, staff, moving in a former cleaning lady and her teenage son, refusing to return to work, suggests he's no longer capable of leading this company. I have medical clearance from 3 different doctors, Richard interrupted. They all agree that while I need time to recover physically, my mental faculties are completely intact. Then explain your bizarre behavior, Victoria chimed in. Living with the help, letting them turn your mansion into their playground. The Richard Maxwell I knew would never... The Richard Maxwell you knew was a fool, Richard cut her off. A fool who cared more about appearances than substance. A fool who almost married a woman who was plotting to steal his company, murmurs, spread around the table. Richard nodded to Maria, who pulled out her phone and pressed play. Victoria's voice filled the room. Soon we'll have total control, and you'll have your part as we agreed. The color drained from Victoria's face. Peter jumped up. That recording is inadmissible. It was obtained without consent. Actually, Richard's lawyer spoke up. New York is a one-party consent state for recordings, and we have much more. Bank. Transfers to offshore accounts, secret meetings with competitors, documents being altered while Mr. Maxwell was in a coma. The board members looked at each other, shocked. One of them, Mrs. Anderson, an elderly woman who had known Richard's father, spoke up. Peter, is this true? Peter loosened his collar. These are baseless accusations. We have proof of everything, Richard said quietly. Maria heard and saw it all during her nights at the hospital. While you thought I was just a body in a bed, she was paying attention. She protected me and this company while my own brother and fiancé tried to steal it. She was just a cleaning lady, Victoria burst out. She's nothing. And now she has you wrapped around her finger, living in your house, probably planning to marry you for your money. Enough, Richard's voice thundered through the room. Maria saved my life, not just by calling the nurses when I first showed signs of waking up, but by giving me something to wake up for. While you were planning to take everything from me, she was reading to me, talking to me, treating me like a human being instead of a bank account. He wheeled himself around to face the board. I'm not asking you to understand my personal choices. I'm telling you that, without Maria's vigilance, this company would already be in the hands of our competitors. She's not after my money. She's turned down every offer I've made to give her a stake in the company. She's not trying to control me. She's the one who encouraged me to come back to work when I'm ready. Mrs. Anderson smiled. She reminds me of your mother, Richard, a hard worker who sees the real value in people. Exactly, Richard smiled back. My father married his cleaning lady, and they built this company together. I forgot that for a while, got caught up in the society life. But my accident reminded me of what really matters. This is ridiculous, Peter sputtered. You can't possibly... I think we've heard enough, Mrs. Anderson cut him off. She turned to the other board members. Shall we vote? The vote was nearly unanimous. Peter and Victoria were removed from the board, pending criminal investigation, into their actions during Richard's coma. Richard would remain CEO, with a temporary appointed assistant to help him until he was fully recovered. As security escorted Peter and Victoria out, she turned back one last time. This isn't over, Richard. That woman and her brat will ruin you. No, Victoria, Richard said calmly. You ruined yourself. Maria and Tommy? They saved me. After everyone left, Maria helped Richard into his car. They drove home in comfortable silence, both processing the events of the day. Thank you, Richard finally said as they pulled up to the mansion. For everything. Maria smiled. That's what family does, right? The word hung between them, full of meaning. Before either could say more, Tommy came running out of the house, still in his baseball uniform. How did it go? Did you win? Did they believe you about Uncle Peter and Miss Victoria being bad guys? Richard laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. We won, buddy, all thanks to your mum. Tommy beamed at his mother. I knew you could do it, Mum. You always say the truth comes out in the end. As they went inside, the mansion felt different. It wasn't just a big empty house anymore, it was a home. The smell of Rose's cooking came from the kitchen. Maria had hired the older woman as their cook, giving her a chance just like she'd been given. Tommy's baseball gear lay by the door, and family photos, real ones of happy moments, had replaced the staged portraits on the walls. "I got an A on my math test," Tommy announced as they sat down to dinner. "And coach says I might be starting pitcher in the next game." "That's wonderful," Maria hugged her son. "We'll all be there to watch, right, Richard?" "Wouldn't miss it," Richard smiled, "though you might have to help me with the stairs to the bleachers." "Always," Maria said softly, their eyes meeting across the table. Later that night, after Tommy went to bed, they sat in the garden. The evening was cool and Maria wrapped a blanket around Richard's shoulders. "The board members weren't the only ones who noticed, you know," he said quietly. "Noticed what?" "How much you remind them of my mother. A strong woman who wasn't afraid of hard work, who saw the best in people." He took her hand. "Who made a house feel like a home." Maria's heart skipped a beat, but before she could respond, a car alarm went off in the distance. The moment passed, but something had shifted. Something that felt a lot like possibility. Inside the house, Tommy watched them from his window and smiled. Maybe, he thought, sometimes the best families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones you build together, one day at a time. The next few weeks brought a sense of peace to the Maxwell mansion. Richard grew stronger each day, now able to walk short distances with a cane. Tommy's baseball team made it to the regional championships, and Maria settled into her role as the heart of their unusual family. But peace never lasts long in stories like these. It started with a letter delivered by courier. Maria found Richard in his study, staring at the paper with a troubled expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down his morning coffee. "It's from my mother's sister, Aunt Eleanor. She's coming to visit." Richard rubbed his temples. "She lives in Europe and hasn't been back since Mother's funeral. Says she read about my accident in the international papers and wants to make sure I'm being properly cared for." Maria felt a flutter of anxiety. "She doesn't approve of me being here, does she? Eleanor is traditional. She never approved of my father marrying my mother. Said it caused a scandal that haunted the family for years." He reached for Maria's hand. "But I'm not going to let her make you feel unwelcome in your own home." The words, "your own home," made Maria's heart skip, but before she could respond, Tommy burst into the study. "Mom, Mr. Maxwell, you'll never believe who's at school." "Slow down, mi amor," Maria said. "What's happening?" "Dad, he got a job as the new baseball coach. He can't do that, can he? He can't just show up at my school." Richard's face darkened. "I'll call the principal." "No," Maria cut in. "Carlos has a right to work, and if we fight this, it'll only make things worse for Tommy." "He's doing it on purpose." Tommy slumped into a chair. "He keeps telling the other kids about how he's my dad, how he and Mom are just taking a break, how we'll be a family again soon. It's embarrassing." Maria knelt beside her son. "Tommy, look at me. Your father can say whatever he wants. We know the truth." "Yeah, but..." Tommy looked down. "Some of the kids believe him. Even Jenny Martinez, the girl like. She asked me why I'm living here if my dad wants us back." Richard wheeled closer. "Do you want to switch schools? We can find you a new..." "No." Tommy stood up straight. "I'm not running away. That's what he does, not me." Pride shone in Maria's eyes. Her son was growing up, becoming stronger than his father had ever been. The doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. Rosa's voice called from the hallway. "Senora Maria, there's a lady here who says she's Mr. Richard's aunt." Maria and Richard exchanged looks. Eleanor Maxwell had arrived 2 days early. The woman who swept into the study was elegant, in the way that only old money can be. Her silver hair perfectly styled, her designer outfit immaculate. Her eyes took in everything. Richard in his wheelchair, Maria in her simple dress, Tommy in his baseball uniform. "My dear nephew," Eleanor's voice was like frost on glass. "I see the newspapers weren't exaggerating after all." "Aunt Eleanor." Richard straightened in his chair. "You're early." Clearly not early enough. Her gaze fixed on Maria. "And this must be the help I've read so much about." "This is Maria," Richard said firmly. "And her son Tommy. They live here, they're family." Eleanor's laugh was cold. "Family? Richard, darling, I know the accident was traumatic, but surely you can see how this looks. Your mother may have been a cleaning lady who got lucky, but at least she had the decency to learn proper manners before being seen in public. Maria felt the sting of the words but held her head high. Would you like some tea, Mrs. Maxwell? Rosa just baked some fresh cookies as well. How domestic, Eleanor smiled without warmth. Tell me, does playing house with my nephew come with her good benefits package? That's enough, Richard's voice cracked like a whip. You will not speak to Maria that way in her own home. Her home? Eleanor's eyebrows shot up. Has she managed to get that in writing already? My, she works faster than your mother did. Tommy stepped forward, his young face fierce. Don't talk about my mum like that. She takes care of Mr. Maxwell because she cares about him, not because of his money. She worked 3 jobs after my dad left, never asked for help from anyone. She's the strongest person I know. Eleanor blinked, taken aback by the boy's passionate defense. For a moment, something like respect flickered in her eyes. Well, she said, more quietly, perhaps there's more here than meets the eye. She turned to Richard. Your mother had that same fire, you know, that same dignity despite what everyone said about her. The tension in the room shifted slightly. Eleanor sat down, smoothing her skirt. I suppose I could stay for that tea, and perhaps you could tell me how all this came to be. As Maria went to help Rosa with the tea service, she heard Tommy enthusiastically telling Eleanor about his baseball team and Richard's promise to come to his games. The older woman's responses were still reserved but less frigid. In the kitchen, Rosa patted Maria's hand. Don't let her get to you, mihija. I worked for families like hers for 40 years. They think money makes them better than us. But real worth? That comes from the heart. Maria arranged cookies on a silver tray, remembering how she used to serve tea to Victoria and her society friends, invisible to them all. Now she would serve it as a member of the household, her head held high. When she returned to the study, she found Eleanor examining the family photos on Richard's desk. There was Tommy's baseball team photo, a candid shot of Maria and Richard laughing in the garden, and a picture of all 3 of them at Tommy's last game. He looks happy, Eleanor said softly, almost to herself. Happier than I've seen him since his mother died. He makes us happy too, Maria said, setting down the tea tray. Eleanor turned to her, eyes sharp but not unkind. You know this won't be easy, don't you? Society can be cruel. Peter and Victoria still have powerful friends, and now with your ex-husband in the picture. The best things in life rarely come easy, Maria replied, pouring the tea with steady hands. A hint of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. You sound just like my sister-in-law. She accepted a cup. Perhaps we should talk about how to handle the upcoming charity gala. If you're to be part of this family, there are things you should know. It wasn't acceptance, not quite. But it was a beginning. As they sat drinking tea, Tommy regaling Eleanor with baseball statistics, while Richard watched with amused pride, Maria felt something settle in her heart. They would face more storms. Carlos's schemes, society's judgment, Peter and Victoria's revenge. But they would face them together, as a family. The annual Maxwell Industries Charity Gala was the biggest social event of the season. This year, it felt more like walking into a lion's den. Maria stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing down the elegant blue gown Eleanor had helped her choose. The older woman had spent the past week teaching her the basics of high society. Which fork to use, how to make small talk, how to handle awkward questions about her background. You look beautiful, Mom, Tommy said from the doorway. He was handsome. In his first tuxedo, his hair neatly combed for once. And you look so grown up, Maria smiled, fighting back tears. I can't believe my baby is going to his first formal event. Mom, Tommy groaned, but he was grinning. I'm not a baby anymore. I'm the starting pitcher for the championship game next week. You'll always be my baby, Maria kissed his cheek. Even when you're a famous baseball player. Richard appeared, behind Tommy, walking with his cane but standing straight and proud. The sight of him made Maria's heart skip. He looked devastating in his tuxedo, his silver hair adding to his distinguished appearance. Ready? He asked softly. Maria took a deep breath. As I'll ever be. The ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel was a sea of designer dresses and expensive suits. Conversations hushed as they entered. all eyes turning to them. Maria felt Tommy tense beside her. Heads high, Eleanor whispered, appearing at their side in a stunning purple gown. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." The whispers followed them across the room. Maria caught fragments. "The maid. Can you imagine? His poor mother must be rolling in her grave." "Maria," a familiar voice called out. Jenny Martinez, Tommy's crush from school, waved from where she stood with her parents. Her father was a prominent surgeon who had treated Richard after his accident. "Dr. Martinez," Richard smiled warmly. "I'm so glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," Dr. Martinez shook his hand. "My wife and I were just saying how well you look. And Maria, you're stunning." Mrs. Martinez hugged Maria. "That color is perfect on you." "We must do lunch soon. Jenny talks about Tommy constantly, and I'd love to get to know you better." Tommy and Jenny both blushed, sneaking glances at each other. Maria felt tears threatening again. These people, at least, saw them as equals. The moment of warmth was shattered by Victoria's arrival. She wore a red dress that screamed for attention, and on her arm was Carlos. "Oh no," Tommy whispered. Maria's ex-husband had cleaned up well. His usual flashiness toned down to fit the formal setting, but his eyes were cold as he surveyed the room, lingering on Maria with a calculating look that made her skin crawl. "Ignore them," Richard said quietly, his hand finding hers. "They're trying to provoke us," but ignoring them became impossible when Victoria clinked her glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement to make." The room fell silent. Victoria's smile was pure poison as she continued. "As many of you know, there have been some changes at Maxwell Industries lately. Our dear Richard has been through so much, and in his vulnerable state, certain people have taken advantage." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Maria felt Richard's hand tighten on hers. "But tonight," Victoria went on, "we have someone here who wants to set things right." "Carlos?" Maria's ex-husband stepped forward, all white teeth and fake sincerity. "I've been silent too long. When I learned that my wife and son were living with another man, I was shocked. Maria and I are not divorced, we're merely separated. And now I want my family back." The whispers turned to gasps. Tommy moved closer to his mother, his face pale with anger. "That's a lie," he shouted. "You left us. You signed the divorce papers." "Tommy, mi hijo." Carlos spread his arms. "I know you're angry, but I'm still your father, and I can't stand by while another man tries to replace me." "No one is replacing you," Tommy's voice shook. "Mr. Maxwell is just a better man than you'll ever be." The crowd's attention swung between the drama unfolding on the floor and Richard's reaction. He stood perfectly still, his face calm but his knuckles white on his cane. "Actually," Victoria smiled, "we have proof that the divorce was never properly filed, which means Maria is still legally married, living with another man in front of her impressionable son. Well, it doesn't look good, does it?" "That's impossible," Maria whispered. "I have the papers." "Check again," Carlos smirked. "Sometimes papers get lost in the system." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "If you're quite finished with this theatrical display, I believe we're here for charity, not cheap melodrama." "Mrs. Maxwell," Victoria simpered, "surely you of all people understand the importance of family values." "I understand the importance of truth." Eleanor's voice could have frozen fire. "And I understand that the only people trying to take advantage of my nephew are standing right there in cheap designer knockoffs." Victoria's face flushed. "How dare you?" "I dare because I've seen what real love looks like," Eleanor continued. "I watched my brother marry a cleaning lady, and I was wrong to judge them. They built something beautiful together, and now I'm watching history repeat itself, but this time I won't stand in the way of happiness." The room was silent, hanging on every word. "As for you," Eleanor turned to Carlos, "I've had my lawyers check every detail of your divorce from Maria. If any papers are missing, we'll find out why. And if anyone has been tampering with legal documents, they'll face the consequences." Carlos's confident smile faltered. Victoria grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit. "This isn't over," she hissed. "Actually, it is," Richard finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but carried across the room. I've loved Maria since before. My accident. I was just too blind to see it, and Tommy, he's the son I never had, so yes, we're an unusual family, but we're a real one. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to leave, both this party and my company. Maria stared at him, her heart pounding. He loved her? Since before the accident. The room erupted in conversation. Some guests headed for the doors, but others, including the Martinezes, moved closer to show their support. Did you mean that? Maria whispered to Richard. About loving me? He turned to her, his eyes soft. Every word. I think I fell in love with you that night in my office, when you were the only one who saw past my wealth to the real me. I was just too caught up in appearances to admit it. Tommy made a gagging noise. Gross, but also kind of awesome. Jenny appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. Super awesome, she agreed. The party continued, but something had shifted. The battle lines were clearly drawn now. Victoria and Carlos had shown their hand, and while they had allies, they had also revealed their true colors to many who had been on the fence. Later that night, as they drove home, Tommy fell asleep in the back seat. Maria watched. Richard's profile in the darkness. You know they won't give up, she said softly. Victoria and Carlos. Let them try. Richard took her hand. We're stronger together, and now everyone knows it. Maria smiled, squeezing his hand. They had faced scandal, family drama, and social judgment. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way. As a family bound not by blood or law, but by something much stronger. Love. The morning of Tommy's championship baseball game dawned bright and clear. The whole household was buzzing with excitement. Rosa had packed a special lunch, Eleanor had cancelled her flight back to Europe to attend, and Richard had arranged for the company's executive box at the stadium to accommodate their growing group of supporters. But Maria couldn't shake her unease. Carlos hadn't been at school all week, calling in sick from his coaching duties. Victoria hadn't been seen since the gala. It was too quiet, like the calm before a storm. Stop worrying, Richard said, coming up behind her as she stared out the kitchen window. Today is about Tommy. I know. Maria turned into his embrace. Since his declaration of love at the gala, they'd grown closer, though neither had pushed for more. There was too much uncertainty with the divorce situation. But I know Carlos. He's planning something. Let him plan. Richard kissed her forehead. We have good lawyers looking into the divorce papers. If he and Victoria tampered with them, we'll find out. Tommy bounded into the kitchen, already in his baseball uniform. Mom, Mr. Maxwell, have you seen the newspaper? Maria's heart sank. As she saw the headline, Maxwell Love Triangle Custody Battle Looms. Below was a picture of Carlos leaving a family court building. He's trying to get custody of me. Tommy's voice cracked. He can't do that. I'm 14. Don't I get a say? Of course you do, mi amor. Maria pulled her son close. And we have proof that he abandoned us, that he never paid child support, that he didn't contact you for 6 years. But the article says, Tommy swallowed hard. It says he's claiming you're an unfit mother because you're living with a man you're not married to, that you're setting a bad example. Richard's face darkened. I'll call the lawyers right now. No. Maria straightened her shoulders. No more lawyers today. Today is about Tommy's game. Carlos wants to upset us, throw us off balance. We won't let him. The stadium was packed when they arrived. The Martinez family was already in the executive box, along with several board members who had sided with Richard at the crucial meeting. Even Mrs. Anderson had come, bringing her grandchildren who were about Tommy's age. Quite a turnout, Eleanor observed, settling into her seat with her usual elegance. Victoria's little plot at the gala seems to have backfired. Nothing brings out supporters like an obvious injustice. Maria barely heard her. She had just spotted Carlos in the coaching box wearing the school's uniform. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had called in sick all week. Mom? Tommy stood at her side, his mitt clutched tight. I can do this, right? Even with him watching? Maria knelt to straighten his cap, just as she had done before every game since he was 7. You can do anything, mi amor. Just focus on the game. Nothing else matters. Actually, Richard stepped forward, leaning on his cane. There is one thing that matters. He pulled something from his pocket, a small box. I was going to wait until after the game, he said, his voice carrying. In the private box. But I think Tommy should know before he goes out there. He turned to Maria. I love you. I think I've loved you since that night you asked if I was all right, the only person who saw past my wealth to my soul. I know there are complications, legal battles ahead, but I don't want to wait anymore. He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring. Maria Rodriguez, will you marry me? Not for society, not for appearances, not even for Tommy, though God knows I love him like my own son, but because you make me happier than I've ever been. Maria felt tears rolling down her cheeks. Tommy was grinning so wide his face might split. Eleanor was dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, trying to maintain her composure. Yes, Maria whispered. Then louder, yes. The box erupted in cheers and congratulations. Jenny hugged Tommy, who was too happy to even be embarrassed. Mrs. Anderson kissed Maria's cheek, whispering, your mother-in-law would have been so proud. Through the window of the box, Maria saw Carlos watching. His face was twisted with rage. He pulled out his phone, stalking away from the field. Mum? Tommy's voice brought her back to the moment. Will you put the ring on? I want to see it before I go play. Richard slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, not too flashy but still elegant, just like them. Now go win that championship. Richard hugged Tommy. Son. Tommy hugged him back hard, then ran down to the field. Maria watched him go, her heart full. Whatever Carlos was planning, they would face it together. The game was intense from the first pitch. Tommy played better than he ever had, his fastball nearly unhittable. By the 7th inning, his team was up by 2 runs, and the crowd was going wild. Then Maria saw Victoria enter the stadium, making her way to where Carlos stood. They talked intensely, Victoria showing him something on her phone. Carlos's face lit up with malicious triumph. Something's wrong. Maria gripped Richard's hand. Before he could respond, uniformed police officers appeared at the entrance to their box. Maria Rodriguez, one stepped forward. We have a warrant for your arrest. The room went silent. Eleanor stood up, every inch the family matriarch. On what charges? Fraud and theft, Victoria's voice came from behind the officers. She sauntered in, waving papers. We have proof that Ms. Rodriguez stole jewelry from the Maxwell mansion during her time as a cleaning lady. Family heirlooms, to be precise. That's ridiculous, Richard's voice boomed. Nothing was ever stolen. Oh, but it was, Victoria smiled. The sapphire necklace your mother left you, the one you were saving for your wife, mysteriously disappeared right around the time Maria started working there. And now we have proof she pawned it. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. The necklace, but you were wearing it at the engagement party. Was I? Victoria's smile turned cruel. Or was it a replica? The original is still missing, and we have security. Footage from 3 years ago, showing someone who looks very much like you accessing the safe. This is absurd, Eleanor stepped forward. That necklace was a fake to begin with. My brother sold the original to save the company during the recession 30 years ago. Everyone in the family knows that. Victoria's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. Nevertheless, we have evidence of theft. Officers, please do your duty. On the field below, Tommy had just struck out another batter when he turned and saw the police in the box. Even from a distance, Maria could see his face. Crumple, please, she turned to the officers. My son's championship game. Mum. Tommy's voice carried across the stadium as he ran toward the box, abandoning his position on the field. Mum, what's happening? Return to your position, son, Carlos called out, his voice sickly sweet. Let the police handle this. You'll be better off with me anyway. The game had ground to a halt. The crowd was watching the drama unfold in the executive box. Jenny was crying, her parents trying to shield her from the scene. Mrs. Anderson was on the phone, presumably with her lawyer contacts, and through it all, Maria stood straight and proud, even as the officers approached with handcuffs. She looked at Richard, trying to memorize his face, then at Tommy, her beautiful boy who had already been through so much. "It's okay, mi amor," she called down to him. "Everything will be okay. Finish your game. Make me proud." As the officers led her away, she heard Richard's voice, strong and certain. "I'll have you out in an hour. This changes nothing, I love you." She held on to those words as they took her down to the waiting police car. She held on to Tommy's face, Richard's love, their family's support. Whatever Victoria and Carlos had planned, they wouldn't win. The Micho. Truth would come out. It had to. The police station was cold and impersonal, but Maria held her head high. She had been fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell, all while Victoria watched with a triumphant smile. But Maria hadn't given her the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The game must be over by now, she whispered to herself, wondering if Tommy had been able to finish playing, wondering if he was okay. "Maria," Richard's voice echoed through the station. He appeared at the cell door with Eleanor and a team of lawyers. "We're getting you out of here right now." The desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork. "Sir, there. Our procedures. I have a judge's order." One of the lawyers stepped forward, presenting documents. "The evidence against Ms. Rodriguez is questionable at best, and we have proof of tampering." Victoria, who had been lounging in a chair nearby, stood up quickly. "What proof? You can't possibly—" "Actually, we can." Eleanor's voice was cold as ice. "You see, Victoria dear, you made one crucial mistake. Several, actually." The sergeant was already unlocking Maria's cell. She rushed into Richard's arms, breathing in his familiar scent. "Tommy?" she asked immediately. "He finished the game," Richard smiled. "Won it for his team. Jenny's parents took him for ice cream to celebrate and keep him distracted. He's worried sick about you, but he's safe." "Not for long." Carlos appeared in the doorway, his face dark with anger. "I've already filed for emergency custody." "No judge. We'll let my son live in a house with a criminal." "That's where you're wrong," another voice joined them. Mrs. Anderson walked in, followed by a distinguished-looking man in judicial robes. "Judge Williams is an old friend of mine. He's very interested in hearing about how you and Ms. Cambridge conspired to frame an innocent woman." Victoria's face went pale. "You can't prove anything." "Can't we?" Eleanor pulled out her phone. "You really should be more careful about hiring people to forge documents, my dear. My private investigators found your contact at the security company. The one who doctored the footage to make it look like Maria accessed the safe. He was quite cooperative once we found the money trail leading back to you." "And let's talk about those divorce papers," Mrs. Anderson added. "The court clerk who lost them just admitted to being paid to make them disappear. By you, Carlos." Carlos backed toward the door. "You're lying. You can't—" "Oh, but we can." Judge Williams spoke for the first time. "Mr. Rodriguez, Ms. Cambridge, I suggest you both come with me. We have a lot to discuss about tampering with evidence, perjury, and attempting to frame an innocent woman." Victoria looked around wildly, then pointed at Maria. "She seduced Richard. She planned this all along, working her way into his life, taking advantage of his condition after the accident." "That's enough!" Richard's voice thundered through the station. "The only people who took advantage of my condition were you and my brother. Maria saved me. Not just my life, but my soul. She reminded me of who I really am, of what really matters." "Well said, nephew," Eleanor smiled. "Now, shall we go get Tommy? I believe we have a championship to celebrate." As they walked out of the station, Maria leaning on Richard's arm, she finally let her tears fall. "I was so scared," she whispered. "Not for me, but for Tommy. The way he looked when they took me away. He's stronger than you know." Richard kissed her temple. Just like his mother, they found Tommy at the ice cream parlor, surrounded by his team and what seemed like half the parents from school. When he saw Maria, he knocked over his chair, running to hug her. "Mom, I knew they were lying. I knew you'd never steal anything." Maria held her son tight, breathing in the familiar mix of baseball dust and teenage boy. "I'm so proud of you, mi amor. You won the game. You should have seen him," Jenny's father grinned. "After you were taken away, he pitched like a man possessed, struck out 6 batters in a row." "I did it for you, Mom," Tommy said, his face buried in her shoulder. "I knew Mr. Maxwell would fix everything, and I wanted you to be proud when you got out." "I'm always proud of you." Maria kissed his head. "Always." The bell above the shop door chimed as more people entered. Board members, school parents. even some of the society ladies who had once looked down their noses at Maria. All of them had come to show their support. You see? Eleanor touched Maria's arm. Real class has nothing to do with money or social status. It's about character. And you, my dear, have more class in your little finger than Victoria Cambridge has in her whole body. What's going to happen to them? Tommy asked. Dad and Victoria. They'll face charges, Judge Williams said gravely. Tampering with court documents, false accusations, conspiracy to commit fraud. It's very serious. And Peter? Richard asked. Was he involved? The judge nodded. We found evidence linking him to the scheme. All three of them were working together, trying to discredit you and Maria so they could take control of the company. Maria felt Richard's arm tighten around her. It's really over? Almost, he smiled. There's just one thing left to do. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Maria Rodriguez, now that your divorce is officially confirmed as legal and all charges against you have been dropped, will you marry me? Again? This time without any clouds hanging over us? The envoy. Ice cream shop erupted in cheers and applause. Tommy made gagging noises, but couldn't hide his huge grin. Jenny wiped happy tears from her eyes. Yes, Maria laughed through her own tears. 1,000 times yes. Eleanor cleared her throat. Well, since we're all here, I might have called a few people. The judge is already present after all. Maria looked around in surprise. Rosa had appeared with a bouquet of flowers. Mrs. Anderson's granddaughter was sprinkling rose petals from her purse. Someone had quickly hung streamers from the ice cream parlor's ceiling fans. Right here, right now. Maria looked down at her simple dress, still creased from her time in the cell. You've never looked more beautiful, Richard said softly. What do you say? Ready to become Mrs. Maxwell in the most unconventional way possible? Maria looked at Tommy, who nodded enthusiastically. She looked at their gathered friends and supporters, all smiling and eager. She looked at Eleanor, who had become the mother figure she never had. Finally, she looked at Richard, the man who had seen past her uniform to her heart, who had trusted her with his life and his love. I say yes, she smiled. After all, nothing about our story has been conventional. Why start now? Judge Williams stepped forward, beaming. Well then, shall we begin? And there, in an ice cream parlor surrounded by their unusual but perfect family, with Tommy serving as best man and Jenny as impromptu maid of honor, with Eleanor dabbing at her eyes and Mrs. Anderson throwing rice she'd somehow produced from her massive purse, Richard and Maria began their next chapter. It wasn't the fairy tale wedding Victoria had once planned in the society pages. It was better. It was real. 1 year later, the Maxwell mansion was transformed. The once cold halls echoed with laughter and life. Photos of Tommy's baseball victories hung beside elegant family portraits. Rosa's cooking filled the kitchen with warmth and delicious smells. And in Richard's study, where he had once sat alone with his wealth, a family photo took pride of place. Him and Maria on their ice cream parlor wedding day, Tommy between them, all three laughing with pure joy. And you believe it's been a year? Maria asked, straightening Richard's tie as they prepared for the annual charity gala. This time she didn't feel nervous. This was her home, her family, her life. Best year of my life. Richard pulled her close for a kiss. At 60, he had never been happier or healthier. The doctors had declared him fully recovered months ago, amazed at his progress. Gross! Tommy's voice came from the doorway. At 15, he was taller now, his shoulders broadening from baseball practice. Can you guys not? Jenny's going to be here any minute. Maria smiled at her son. He and Jenny had been officially dating for 6 months, their young love sweet and innocent. Jenny's parents had become close friends, often joining them for dinner or baseball games. The doorbell rang and Tommy rushed to answer it. Eleanor's voice drifted up from the foyer. There's my favorite great-nephew. Eleanor had sold her house in Europe and moved back to New York permanently. She said it was because she missed the city, but they all knew it was because she had finally found the family connection she'd been missing all her life. Is everything ready for the announcement? Richard asked quietly. Maria nodded, touching her stomach with a secret smile. They had been waiting for the right moment to tell everyone their news. At 40, she hadn't expected this blessing. But life had a way of surprising you. The gala was being held at their home this year. The mansion's gardens were lit with thousands of tiny lights and tables dotted the lawn. The guest list was smaller than in previous years, only true friends and loyal. Supporters were invited. Victoria, Carlos, and Peter were conspicuously absent, serving time for their crimes. Victoria had broken down on the witness stand, revealing every detail of their scheme. Carlos had tried to flee to Mexico but was caught at the border. Peter had attempted to blame everything on them, but the evidence had been overwhelming. Mrs. Maxwell? Rosa appeared at the door. The first guests are arriving. Maria still felt a thrill at being called Mrs. Maxwell, not because of the name's prestige, but because it meant she was Richard's wife, Tommy's legal mother, part of this beautiful family they had built. The evening was perfect. Tommy and Jenny danced awkwardly but sweetly under the stars. Eleanor held court with the society ladies who had once shunned Maria, but now sought her friendship. Mrs. Anderson brought her newest grandbaby, letting Maria cuddle the infant with knowing eyes. "I think it's time," Richard whispered in Maria's ear. She nodded, and he clinked his glass for attention. The gathered crowd, friends, family, loyal employees, turned to listen. "A year ago," Richard began, "many of you were there when Maria and I got married in Jenny's father's ice cream parlor." Laughter and fond remembrances rippled through the crowd. "It wasn't the wedding some people thought I should have," he continued, squeezing Maria's hand. "It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it was perfect because it was real, just like our family." Tommy moved closer, sensing something important was coming, and now, Richard smiled, "our real, perfect, unconventional family is growing." Maria stepped forward. "We're having a baby." The garden erupted in cheers. Tommy's jaw dropped, then he broke into a huge grin. "I'm going to be a big brother." "You already are a big brother." Maria hugged him close. "This baby will just make it official." Eleanor was crying openly, not even trying to maintain her usual composure. "Alexandra," she said softly. "If it's a girl, you should name her Alexandra, after Richard's mother. And if it's a boy," Jenny asked, holding Tommy's hand. Maria and Richard exchanged looks. They had already decided. "Roberto," Maria said, "after Rosa's late husband, who was more of a father to me than my own." Rosa burst into tears, hugging Maria tightly. "Oh, mi hija." The celebration continued late into the night. Friends who had stood by them through the darkest times now shared their joy. Tommy and Jenny snuck innocent kisses in the garden. Helena and Mrs. Anderson planned a baby shower that would put royal celebrations to shame. Later, after the guests had gone and Tommy had fallen asleep watching old baseball games with Jenny's head on his shoulder, Maria and Richard stood in the nursery they had secretly been preparing. "Are you happy?" Richard asked, holding her from behind as they looked at the crib Eleanor had found, the same one that had held Richard as a baby. "More than I ever dreamed possible." Maria turned in his arms. "Sometimes I think about that night in your office, when I asked if you were all right. If someone had told me then that this would be my life, that was the night I started falling in love with you," Richard said. "I just didn't know it yet. And now look at us." Maria laughed softly. "The cleaning lady and the billionaire expecting a baby." "No," Richard shook his head. "Just Richard and Maria, who found each other against all odds, who built a family based on love instead of expectations, who proved that happy endings don't just happen in fairy tales." From down the hall they heard Tommy's sleepy voice. "Dad, can you help me get Jenny to the guest room? She fell asleep during the 7th inning." Richard kissed Maria quickly. "Duty calls. The joys of having a teenager." "Our teenager," Maria smiled. "Go on, I'll be in bed soon." After Richard left, Maria stood in the nursery doorway, one hand on her stomach. The moonlight streamed through the windows, bathing the room in silver light. On the walls, Eleanor had helped her hang photos, Richard's mother in her cleaning uniform, proudly holding him as a baby. Rosa and her Roberto on their wedding day. Maria and Tommy at his first baseball game. The ice cream parlor wedding. Their perfect, unconventional, beautiful family. "Your big brother is going to spoil you rotten," she whispered to her unborn child. And your father. He's going to show you that love doesn't care about social class or bank accounts. Your Aunt Eleanor will teach you proper manners, but also how to stand up for what's right. Rosa will feed you too many sweets, and Mrs. Anderson will sneak you presents. And Jenny will probably babysit you while Tommy practices baseball. She heard footsteps behind her and felt Richard's arms wrap around her again. And your mother, he said softly, will show you that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about princesses in castles. Sometimes they're about brave women who work hard, love deeply, and change lives just by being themselves. Maria leaned back against him, feeling the baby move beneath her hands. Outside, the garden lights still twinkled. Somewhere in the house, Tommy was probably trying to sneak one last text to Jenny before bed. Eleanor was likely in her room, already planning the baby's entire future. And here, in this quiet moment, Maria felt the truth of happy endings. They weren't about wealth or status or proving anything to anyone. They were about finding your place, your people, your purpose. They were about building something real and strong and lasting. They were about love in all its unexpected, unconventional, perfectly imperfect forms. "Ready for bed?" Richard asked. Maria nodded, taking one last look at the nursery. At the future. They had built together, ready for everything, she smiled. And they walked hand in hand to their room, leaving the moonlight to dance over the photos of their family. The family they had chosen, built and fought for. The family that proved that sometimes the best stories aren't about where you start, but about where love leads you. The end.